Hey everybody, 4D Sparky here. I'm going to do a little video tutorial today about how your camera's onboard light meter can lie to you. I'm going to do that with a little demonstration here I've set up with a couple of DSLR cameras, a simple gray background, and it's all illuminated with a couple of modeling lights from my studio strobes. I've set it up so where I get at ISO 6400 with this gray background a 60th of a second at f8. That's because the camera is metering the amount of light coming in the lens. The problem is the camera doesn't know the difference between a reduced amount of light, simply dialing down one of my model lights cuts the amount of light reaching this gray background, and you can see what it does to the aperture and the shutter speed. It starts to slow the aperture down, or the shutter speed down, and open up the aperture to compensate for that loss of light. The problem is the camera doesn't know any difference between that and putting a dark subject in front of the camera. Here I'm just using the black side of my 5-in-1 reflector, and you can see that by putting that black cloth in front of the camera, it basically does the same thing. The camera doesn't know the difference between a dark subject and less light. Conversely, if I put my white reflector in front of the lens, you can see what happens to the aperture and the shutter speed. The shutter speed is greatly increased and the aperture is reduced, because the camera is assuming that there's more light on the subject and therefore is trying to dial the exposure up a little bit. Reason this is important to us is because a lot of times we'll get into a situation where we've got a subject that is against a light background. So if you were shooting a person in your home and they've got a bright window or a patio door behind them lit by the sun, the camera is going to try to increase the exposure to compensate for that, as you can see here, and we end up basically with an underexposed subject. On the flip side of that, if you've got somebody standing in the sunshine and they've got a dark shadow behind them, you can see that the camera again tries to compensate for that darkness by slowing the shutter down and opening up the aperture. How do you correct for this? The most important thing to do is to make sure that you're aware of not only your subject but what is behind it. Kind of like when you're out hunting, you want to make sure what's behind your target so you don't accidentally shoot somebody. Same theory goes with cameras. Not that you're going to kill anybody, but you want to make sure that the exposure is correct. So what do? A couple things you can do. A lot of cameras have a built-in backlight function. You can engage that function when you are in this type of situation. I'm not sure if there's any cameras that actually have a forelight function. Another thing you can do is go to your exposure compensation and manually override. You can see now I'm at 2/50th at f10, or I can manually override to an 80th at f1, depending on the situation, whether it's a backlight or forelight situation. Another thing you can do is engage the bracketing function of your camera, to where this one is going to take 3 frames 2 stops apart, and it's going to do that and adjust the exposure, so hopefully one of those exposures will work. Another function is, if your camera has it, is this little square right here is a spot meter. Instead of metering the entire frame, I can have it just meter a small portion in the center of the viewfinder. Use that to adjust to get a reading of the light, and then make sure my shutter and aperture match that. Another method is to simply go to manual mode. That way it doesn't matter what your lighting looks like. The aperture and the shutter speed will be exactly where you want them. You can see that the meter is trying to tell me it's over or underexposed, but the settings do not change at all. Another possibility is get yourself a dedicated light meter. This would allow you to walk up to the subject, turn around and aim towards the camera, take a light meter reading. That will tell you how much light is striking the subject. That way you will get a proper exposure, no matter whether it's dark or light. It will be exposed correctly. So hopefully this little video is going to help you a little bit in properly exposing in difficult lighting situations, and realizing when you get into these difficult situations, you have to be able to identify them. Being able to identify these problems is one of the biggest keys in learning how to control exposure in this situation. This is 480 Sparky. Go forth and actuate.